There's a moment right before something changes forever, when the universe goes quiet. Not silent, quiet, like the air itself is holding its breath. I've heard soldiers talk about it. Combat veterans, people who have been in places where the difference between alive and not alive is measured in fractions of a second. They all describe the same thing. This strange, suspended pause where everything slows down and your brain starts cataloging details it normally ignores. The texture of a wall, the smell of someone's jacket, the way light hits a surface at a particular angle. I never understood what they meant. Until Cathara Station. Until the day I watched a single human soldier walk into a room full of the most dangerous beings in the known galaxy and make every single one of them flinch. Not with a weapon, not with a threat, just by walking. Let me back up. My name is HFY Storie. I'm a Velhari. You probably know us by our older name, the Reef Dwellers, though most of us find that translation a little embarrassing. We're a cephalopod-adjacent species from the Kashan Drift, and we tend to work in diplomacy, translation, and interspecies coordination because our biology makes us naturally attuned to micro-expressions and emotional subtext. We read rooms the way your species reads text, automatically, without thinking about it. I tell you this because it matters for what happened. Because when the human walked in, I felt the room change before I saw anything, before any of my colleagues registered it consciously. The emotional weather of that chamber shifted the way real weather shifts, gradually at first, then all at once. Fear, not the sharp, screaming kind, the deep kind, the old kind, the kind that lives in the part of a brain that remembers being prey. Every non-human in that room felt it simultaneously. And the human hadn't even spoken yet. Cathara Station sits at the gravitational intersection of 3 star systems, in what used to be neutral space before the Meridian Compact redrew the boundary lines 17 years ago. It's a massive structure, the kind of place that took 4 species 4 decades to build, and even now nobody's entirely sure the architecture is safe. The central hub alone is the size of a small city. Sectors branch off it like the arms of something ancient and slow, each one owned or leased by a different faction, each one operating under its own security protocols and social norms. It's the kind of place where diplomacy happens because it has to. Because the alternative is war, and war in a 3-system confluence zone is the kind of war that doesn't end cleanly. I'd been stationed there for 2 cycles as part of a Velhari observer delegation. Technically, we were neutral. Technically, everyone on Cathara was neutral. The station's founding charter required it. But neutrality is a complicated word. It means different things depending on which side of the table you're sitting on, and the table on Cathara Station had approximately 40 sides, so you can imagine how complicated the word got. The day I'm describing was a coordination summit, joint security briefing. Representatives from 11 factions gathered in Chamber 7, a pressurized room with adjustable atmospheric composition that could support 17 different species simultaneously, though not always comfortably. The Granthari needed it slightly warmer. The Voss Collective preferred lower oxygen ratios. The Cathari natives kept the humidity elevated. By the time you'd compromised enough to keep everyone technically functional, the atmosphere in that room felt like breathing inside a warm, slightly stale cloud. Nobody was happy. That's important context. The summit had been called because of the Dresh incident. 3 weeks prior, a Granthari patrol vessel had fired on what it claimed was an unregistered freighter running black market transit through the Kashan corridor. The freighter had turned out to be a diplomatic courier registered to the Uvari Directorate. Nobody had died, but the courier's crew had been detained, the vessel impounded, and the diplomatic cargo, which nobody would officially describe but everyone unofficially understood contained sensitive treaty documents, had gone missing. So we were all in a room together, 11 factions, approximately 42 representatives, trying to have a professional conversation about accountability and reparations, while simultaneously not admitting that any of us had done anything wrong, wanted anything, or felt anything resembling emotions about the situation. Standard diplomatic procedure, in other words. The human contingent had arrived 2 days before the summit, which I remember noting because humans almost never arrive early. They tend to arrive exactly on time with the slightly breathless energy of people who have been running since before the alarm went off. Early arrival for humans usually means something unusual is happening. There were 3 of them. 2 I recognized from previous station assignments. Commander Yale Oren, who headed the Terran Compact's Security Liaison Office on Cathara, and her technical officer, a young man named Sergeant Dario Vasquez, who I'd spoken with briefly at a cultural exchange event 3 months prior. He'd spent 20 minutes explaining something called a brisket to me with the focused intensity of someone discussing military strategy. I respected that. The 3rd human I didn't recognize. He was introduced in the pre-summit documentation as Specialist Ren Calloway, attached to the Terran Compact Special Operations Advisory Group. His file listed him as a Capability Demonstration Liaison, which is a phrase so deliberately vague that it communicates more information than it seems to. In diplomatic circles, deliberately vague phrasing is always doing heavy lifting. I remember looking at him across the preparation corridor before the summit began and thinking, simply, that he looked tired. That was my first impression, not threatening, not impressive, just tired. He was medium height for a human. I'd learned to gauge their sizes by that point, with close-cropped dark hair going gray at the temples, and the kind of facial structure that suggested he'd spent significant time outdoors under conditions that were not particularly kind. His eyes were dark brown. He was carrying no visible equipment beyond standard Terran liaison insignia. He was wearing the muted gray-green of Terran Special Operations, which is designed to be unremarkable. He looked at me when he noticed me looking at him, and he gave me a small nod. Polite, slightly weary, the nod of someone who's been in too many rooms exactly like this one. I nodded back. Neither of us spoke. I thought nothing more of it. The summit began badly and declined steadily from there. The Granthari representative, a senior officer named Vesh Kadrin, who had the kind of bearing that comes from decades of institutional authority, opened with a prepared statement that managed to simultaneously express regret for the Dresh incident, suggest the incident was primarily the Uvari Directorate's fault for operating in poorly marked transit corridors, and imply that the Uvari had no one to blame but themselves while using the word regrettable 11 times. I counted. Old habit. The Uvari delegation did not take this well. Their lead representative, honored Delegate Merva Soth, was a tall, silver-skinned being whose species expressed agitation through rapid chromatic shifts in their skin. By the time Vesh Kadrin finished his statement, Merva Soth was cycling through approximately 4 colors per second in a pattern that any Uvari would have recognized as barely contained fury. The next hour was, frankly, one of the more exhausting diplomatic experiences of my career, and I've sat through a treaty negotiation that lasted 11 consecutive days with 6-hour sleep rotations. Representatives spoke, others interrupted. Points of order were raised. The atmospheric controls were adjusted twice, when the tension in the room caused several Cathari representatives to begin secreting stress response compounds that conflicted badly with the Granthari's respiratory filters. Through all of it, the human contingent sat quietly at their section of the curved table. Commander Oren made 2 measured procedural interventions. Sergeant Vasquez took notes. Specialist Calloway sat with his hands folded on the table in front of him and watched the room with the same focused, slightly tired attention he'd had in the corridor. He didn't fidget, he didn't check a device, he didn't lean over to whisper to his colleagues. He just watched. I noticed this partly because I notice things. It's what I'm built for, and partly because in a room full of beings in various states of agitation, someone being completely, genuinely still stands out. It's not a comfortable thing to be watched by, I found, that stillness. The summit broke for midpoint recess, approximately 3 hours in. The formal agenda had us scheduled to address the missing cargo issue in the second session, which everyone understood was the actual problem, and which meant the first session had essentially been 3 hours of people circling around a thing nobody wanted to touch directly. I went to get, I don't remember the name of the Velhari equivalent, a nutrient solution, something warm. The kind of thing you get to reset your brain when diplomatic proceedings have started to feel like being slowly pressed between 2 flat surfaces. The station's corridor adjacent to Chamber 7 was wide enough for several species to move comfortably, lit in the soft amber that the station's environmental managers had determined caused the least agitation across the widest range of species. There were benches set at intervals, a hydration station with multiple species-compatible dispensers, and several decorative installations that were supposed to represent the cooperative spirit of the Meridian Compact, though they mostly looked like someone had tried to build a sculpture out of leftover structural components and decided to call it art. I was standing near the hydration station when the Granthari came in. Not Vesh, Kadrin, his junior officers, 4 of them in the dark gray tactical wear that Granthari security officers favor. They were large beings, broader than most bipeds, with heavy bone structure and the kind of muscular composition that comes from a high-gravity homeworld. Granthari aren't aggressive by nature. That's a misconception a lot of species carry, but they're physically imposing in a way that tends to affect the social dynamics of any room they enter. They know this. Most of them have learned to modulate it. These 4 in the recess corridor were not particularly modulating. They were moving with the slightly too deliberate pace of beings who want other beings to notice them moving. Marking territory in a way that has plausible deniability. We're just walking, aren't we? Just stretching our legs, not making any kind of statement at all. The thing they were walking toward was Merva Sath. The Uvari honored delegate was standing near one of the art installations with 2 of her own staff, still cycling through residual stress colors, speaking quietly into a personal communication device. She hadn't noticed the Granthari. Her staff had, though. Both of them shifted positions slightly, that involuntary alignment of a body toward potential threat, and Merva Sath registered their movement and looked up, and then she saw the 4 Granthari and her chromatic cycling stopped. Went flat. That's what Uvari do when they're genuinely frightened. The color drains. They go this particular shade of pale gray that their species evolved as a response to predator presence. The Granthari kept walking. I was calculating response times, wondering whether I should intervene. Technically, as an observer, I wasn't supposed to, but technically didn't always survive contact with reality. When someone moved at the edge of my peripheral vision and I turned, and it was Specialist Calloway. He'd come out of the chamber behind me. He had a container of something in one hand, some kind of Terran beverage, I assumed. The Cathara recess dispensers kept human options stocked, and he was walking with the loose, unhurried stride of someone who has nowhere urgent to be. He turned into the corridor. He saw the situation in approximately 1 second. And then something happened that I have spent a significant portion of the last 4 years trying to adequately describe, and I still don't have perfect language for it. He didn't speed up, he didn't slow down, he didn't change his expression in any identifiable way. He didn't do anything that I can point to and say that was the specific thing. But something about him changed. The quality of his presence in that corridor shifted, like a frequency adjustment, like something that had been tuned down got tuned up, incrementally, precisely, to a level that didn't announce itself but couldn't be ignored. He walked between the Granthari and Merva Sath. Not in a dramatic positioning way, not with any apparent awareness of doing so, he just walked that route. The most natural path through the corridor from where he'd come from, that happened to pass directly between the advancing Granthari and the Uvari delegate. He stopped when he was adjacent to the hydration station, took a drink from his container, looked at the decorative installation with the vague, evaluating expression of someone who is deciding whether they find a piece of art interesting. The Granthari stopped. All 4 of them. They stopped and they looked at him, and for about 4 seconds nothing moved in that corridor except Calloway raising his container to his mouth again and drinking unhurriedly without looking at them. And then, I want to be precise about this, the lead Granthari officer looked at his colleagues and made a small gesture, the kind that means not now or leave it, and all 4 of them adjusted their trajectory and moved to the far side of the corridor and kept walking past the art installation, around the bend, out of sight. Merva Sath's coloration returned. Not immediately, slowly the way color comes back to something that's been cold, but it came back. Calloway finished his drink, looked at the art installation one more moment, then turned and walked back toward the chamber entrance without looking at anyone. As he passed me, he glanced over, that same small nod from the corridor this morning. Polite, slightly weary. I stood there for a moment, trying to process what I'd just observed. I've been in diplomacy for 22 years. I have a comprehensive catalog of physical intimidation tactics, de-escalation techniques, territorial behavior patterns across 37 species, and the specific vocabulary of unspoken threat. What Calloway had done didn't fit any category I had. He'd walked between a potential aggressor and a potential victim, and diffused the situation without a word, without a gesture, without any identifiable action at all. And the Granthari, who outmassed him by a factor of approximately 3, who came from a culture with a thoroughly documented set of social hierarchies around physical dominance, and the display thereof, had looked at him and made the choice to leave. What did they see? That was the question that stayed with me through the rest of the recess. What did they see that I didn't? The second session was worse than the first, which I had not anticipated. The missing cargo issue was introduced by Commander Oren in careful, neutral language, and immediately everything became more complicated. The Granthari insisted the cargo manifest had been falsified. The Uvari insisted the manifest was legitimate, and that the Granthari had deliberately targeted the vessel for political reasons. A third faction, the Holland Combine, who weren't directly involved but had opinions about everything, introduced a procedural motion that effectively suspended any resolution for 30 days, while a formal investigation could be constituted. The room became very loud. At some point during the loudness, I noticed that Specialist Calloway had left his seat. Not in a dramatic way. He was simply no longer at the table. Commander Oren and Sergeant Vasquez remained. Neither of them acknowledged his absence, which suggested it was planned or at least not surprising to them. I noted it, filed it, stayed focused on the room. The loudness continued. What ended it was not a diplomatic intervention. It was not a procedural motion, not a compromise offer, not a strongly worded statement from any of the 11 factions present. What ended it was a sound from outside the chamber. We all heard it simultaneously because Chamber 7's acoustic baffles were not actually that effective, and because the sound was the kind that cuts through other sounds the way certain frequencies cut through interference, not by being louder, but by being fundamentally different. It was a brief series of impacts, rapid, rhythmic, then a very short silence, then a low sound that I don't have adequate vocabulary for in any of the 7 languages I speak fluently. It was the sound of something mechanical being under significant stress. Then silence. Then Specialist Calloway's voice speaking quietly in Standard Common, the interspecies trade language, saying simply, "That's done." The chamber was very still. Commander Oren stood unhurriedly and pressed the communication panel beside her seat. She said, in the same measured tone she'd used all day, "Specialist report." A pause, then Calloway's voice again through the panel. 3 Granthari security officers attempted to access the summit's primary communication relay in Corridor 9. They've been secured. No injuries. I've preserved the access logs. You'll want them. Another pause. Then Commander Oren said, "Good work." And she sat back down. The room was even stiller than before. Vesh Kadrin, the senior Granthari representative, had gone a color I didn't recognize. Not anger, not the flush of embarrassment, something more complicated. He looked like someone doing rapid internal mathematics and arriving at answers he didn't want. 3 of his officers, secured by one human, who had apparently anticipated the attempt, left the chamber at exactly the right moment, positioned himself, and intervened without any backup and without any apparent fuss. Merva Soth, across the table, was watching Vesh Kadrin with an expression that I can only describe as careful satisfaction. Commander Oren allowed the silence to persist for approximately 7 seconds, precisely long enough to be felt without becoming theatrical, and then said, "I think we should discuss the communication relay access logs before we continue with the cargo inquiry. The logs appear to be directly relevant." Nobody argued. I found Calloway afterwards, during the post-session administrative period. He was in the station's secondary observation deck, a curved room with a transparent wall that looked out into the arm of the galaxy we were positioned in. The star density in that region is unusual. It looks, from the observation deck, like someone scattered something luminous across a dark surface, too dense and too varied to resolve into individual points at a glance. He was standing at the transparent wall with his hands clasped loosely behind his back, just looking. I approached him somewhat cautiously because I still wasn't entirely sure how to classify what he was, and I've found that when you can't classify something, Caution is a reasonable default. He heard me coming. His hearing was clearly good and turned slightly. Specialist Calloway, I said in standard common. Delegate Torian, he said. His pronunciation was precise. Not perfect in the way of someone who'd memorized phonetics, but precise in the way of someone who'd listened carefully and practiced. May I ask you something? He looked at me for a moment, then he gestured toward the transparent wall. Come look at this first, he said. It's worth looking at. I came and stood beside him, and we both looked at the stars. He was right, it was worth looking at. After a moment he said, What's your question? This afternoon, I said. In the corridor, the Granthari officers. Yes. What did you do? He considered this. I watched his face, reading what I could. He was one of the more difficult humans I'd tried to read, not because he was hiding things exactly, but because his emotional surface was very quiet. Not flat in the way of someone suppressing, but quiet in the way of a landscape that settled. Like whatever weather had passed through had done its work and moved on. I walked through a corridor, he said. That is not, I said, an adequate answer. He smiled slightly, not quite enough to reach his eyes. No, he agreed, it's not. He was quiet for another moment. My species spent about 300,000 years as prey, he said finally. Before we figured out tools, before we worked out fire and coordination and the rest of it, we were in the middle of the food chain. Things hunted us, so we developed these systems. Ways of reading threat, ways of presenting ourselves to other predators. He paused, looking at the stars. We never entirely lost them, he said. The instincts. When a human is in a state of heightened readiness, it shows in ways that are below the threshold of conscious perception for most species. Micromuscular adjustments, breathing patterns, the way we orient, pheromonal changes. The Granthari can't see or smell most of it, but some of it registers subconsciously. He glanced at me. You can see more of it than they can, he said, can't you? I thought about what I'd registered in that corridor, the quality of his presence shifting. Yes, I said, though I couldn't tell you what specifically I was reading. He nodded. Most species can't. It's not meant to be legible. It's meant to work below the level of analysis. He paused. When we're in the field in genuine threat situations, we operate at a level that most species find deeply unsettling to be near. Not because of what we do, because of what we are in those moments. Something in the neurochemistry shifts, something in the posture, something in the eyes. He was quiet for a moment. The Granthari read it as I don't know the right word in their language, something like apex. Something that says there is a thing here that is more dangerous than me, and it has already decided the outcome. Did you deploy that deliberately? I asked. In the corridor. He thought about it. Yes and no, he said. The state is real. I was genuinely assessing the situation as a threat. The Granthari read a genuine state, not a performance. He looked back at the stars. But I chose to walk that route. I chose to position where I did. The assessment was real. The positioning was a decision. I considered that for a moment. The 3 officers in the corridor, I said, during the session. Yes. You anticipated that. We'd been tracking their movements since they arrived. 2 days ago, before the summit started, certain behavioral indicators. He tilted his head slightly. Your species likely could have spotted the same indicators if you'd known what to look for. What indicators? They were mapping the station, discreetly but consistently. Every off-protocol movement they made corresponded to a relay point or a surveillance node. They weren't doing it randomly. They had a plan. He paused. The communication relay in Corridor 9 is the primary hub for all encrypted summit transmissions. If you accessed it during the session when everyone was focused inside the chamber, you could copy everything. Every private delegation communication, every encoded position paper, every back-channel conversation. The missing cargo, I said slowly. The missing cargo contents, he said. Yes. If someone knew exactly what the Uvari were willing to accept as a settlement, their actual position, the private one, they'd have a very significant negotiating advantage. I was quiet for a moment, reorganizing my understanding of the day's events. You left the chamber at exactly the right time, I said. We'd identified the likely window. He shrugged, a small, economical gesture. It's what we do. That night, station night, the controlled dimming that cycles through each sector on a 26-hour rotation designed to accommodate as many species' circadian rhythms as possible. I filed my observer report and then sat for a long time looking at the wall of my quarters. I've observed humans in diplomatic contexts many times. They're not a simple species to categorize. They're simultaneously the most empathic and the most ruthless beings I've encountered in 22 years of interspecies work. They'll cry at a piece of music and then negotiate with cold precision on an outcome that will affect billions of lives. They form deep bonds and carry extraordinary grief for their dead, and they will walk into danger for strangers with a casualness that other species find incomprehensible. But I'd never quite understood, before Cathara Station, what the galaxy meant when it talked about human soldiers. I'd heard the accounts, of course. Every diplomatic corps had them. The Granthari had a particularly extensive archive of human combat engagements going back to the First Contact Wars, when humanity had arrived on the galactic stage with roughly the subtlety of a geological event, and had managed, within 40 years, to establish itself as a military power that significantly larger and longer-established civilizations were reluctant to antagonize. The Velhari historical analysis of that period described humans as anomalously adapted to violent conflict, which is a phrase that sounds like an insult, but is actually a clinical observation. Humans fight differently from every other species we've encountered. Not better necessarily in terms of raw physical capability. There are a dozen species with greater individual strength, faster reflexes, more robust physiological durability. But the Velhari analysis noted something else. Humans don't fight the way their biology suggests they should. Most aggressive species fight from a position of overwhelming biological advantage. They engage when they're certain they can win. They've evolved to assess threat and only accept combat when the odds are in their favor, because combat is expensive and evolution rewards the survivors. Humans fight when they're losing. More specifically, and this is the part that the Velhari analysis kept returning to in increasingly bewildered tones, humans seem to fight better when they're losing, when conditions are worst, when resources are depleted and casualties are high and logical assessment would suggest withdrawal or surrender. Something in their neurochemistry activates under sustained extreme stress that appears to enhance rather than degrade performance. They become faster and more decisive under pressure, not slower. They think more creatively when options narrow. They maintain unit cohesion under conditions that would fragment any other species we've studied. The analysis also noted, with what I've always read as a kind of exasperated awe, that humans are the only species we've encountered who appear to have made an institutional study of their own combat psychology, and then deliberately engineered training programs to exploit it. They took the most useful aspects of their fear response and turned them into a skill set. They found the part of themselves that functions best in the worst circumstances and figured out how to access it on command. That's what I was trying to understand, sitting in my quarters on Cathara Station after watching Calloway do whatever it was he'd done in that corridor. Not a trick, not a tactic. An expression of something genuine, a state of preparedness so complete and so deeply integrated that it communicated itself without effort, across species lines, to beings who'd never encountered humans before. Something the galaxy's predators recognized. Something they'd apparently decided, on reflection, they didn't want to provoke. There were 6 more days of summit. The Granthari position shifted substantially after the communication relay incident, which had been entered into the formal record along with the access logs, which clearly documented the officers' authorization codes and the data packages they'd attempted to retrieve. Vesh Kadran spent the next 2 sessions in what I can only describe as controlled damage limitation, and he was doing it without the intelligence he'd hoped to have, against an Uvari delegation that now knew exactly how far behind they'd started and had adjusted their strategy accordingly. The Uvari got most of what they wanted. The Granthari officers were remanded to compact, oversight pending investigation. The missing cargo, the treaty documents, turned out to have been placed in a sealed escrow account by the Granthari patrol commander at the time of interdiction, which is not standard protocol, but is also not legally theft. Their return was negotiated as part of the overall settlement. It was not a perfect resolution, it never is, but it was better than it might have been. On the 5th day, during a session recess, I found myself walking with Calloway in the station's botanical sector, a long, curved space filled with plant life from a dozen different worlds, maintained partly for the atmospheric contribution, and partly because someone in the station's original design team had apparently understood that enclosed beings need something that grows. We'd established over the preceding days something that wasn't quite friendship. I'm not sure that's the right word for what forms between species that have known each other for less than a week, but was something in that direction. A mutual recognition, a willingness to exist in the same space and talk honestly. "Can I ask you something?" I said. He made a gesture that I'd learned meant go ahead. "Are you afraid," I asked, "when you do what you do operationally?" He didn't answer immediately. We walked past something with very wide, dark leaves that had tiny luminescent dots on their undersides, something from a low-light forest world, I thought. The dots pulsed slowly. I found them calming. "Yes," he said, "always. That doesn't seem compatible with what I observed." "It's completely compatible," he said. "Fear is the system. That's the thing most species misunderstand about it." He paused, looking at the luminescent leaves as we passed. "Fear is data. It tells you what the threat environment looks like. It sharpens everything. The problem isn't fear. The problem is when fear drives action instead of informing it. And humans have separated those things. In training, we work on it. Yeah." He was quiet for a moment. "The fear state activates the physiological response, the alertness, the reaction time, the narrowing of focus to relevant stimuli. We try to keep the decision-making separate from the reactive state. So you're running on the fear chemistry without being steered by the fear impulse." He paused. "It doesn't always work. It's a skill like anything else. You get better at it. You never perfect it." "What happens when you get it wrong?" I asked. He looked at me. "Bad things," he said simply. "The last night of the summit, there was a reception. These things are diplomatically mandatory, some fiction of communal warmth to paper over what has usually been a week of professional antagonism. Food from multiple cultures, politely sampled. Music from none, to avoid offense. Drinks calibrated to be inoffensive to as many physiological systems as possible, which means they're also barely worth having, but that's the price of inclusion." I was standing near a viewport, a smaller one than the observation deck, but sufficient, when Merva Soth appeared beside me. She was cycling through slow, warm colors, blues and golds, Uvari contentment, cautious but genuine. "Delegate Torian," she said. "Honored delegate," I said. "The outcome seems to have been favorable." "More favorable than it might have been," she said. She was quiet for a moment, watching the stars. "The human specialist," she said, "Calloway." "Yes. He saved us something," she said, not easily, like the words cost something. "In the corridor on the second day." I said nothing, waiting. "I have encountered humans before," she said. "In professional contexts, they are difficult to read. They seem very small and then they do not seem small at all." She paused. "I have studied the historical accounts, the contact war engagements, the Outer Reach incident, humans in battle." She turned to look at me, her chromatics steady. "The accounts all say the same thing, that the most frightening thing is not their capability. It is that they do not stop." "No," I agreed. "Every species has a threshold," she said. "A point where the cost becomes too high and the calculation changes. Humans seem to recalculate differently. When it becomes too costly, they do not become less committed. They become more." She shook her head slightly, a gesture she'd picked up from human colleagues, I suspected. "I do not understand it." "I think it's because of what they're fighting for," I said slowly. "When they choose to fight, it's rarely abstract." "Explain." I thought about Calloway in the corridor, walking a route, putting himself between a threat and a person who needed him to do that without any signal, without any request. "Humans don't fight for concepts very well," I said. "They fight for specifics, this person, this place, this thing that matters to me specifically." I paused. "When they have a specific, they are very hard to move from it." Merva Soth considered this for a long moment. "That is either beautiful or terrifying," she said. "Probably both," I said. She made the noise that Uvari make when they encounter something true, low and brief. "Probably both," she agreed. The summit ended, delegations dispersed. The Granthari officers went to compact custody. The Uvari went home with their settlement and their returned documents. The Holland Combine filed 17 procedural objections to the outcome and then also went home. I had a 2-day transit window before my next assignment, and I spent part of it finishing my observer report, and part of it sitting with the quiet fact that something had shifted for me over the course of that week. I've spent my career among the multi-species politics of the Meridian Compact and its neighbors. I've watched the great powers maneuver and the small ones survive. I've seen wars start and wars end, and I've helped in my modest way with some of the ending. I know what fear looks like in a room. I know what power looks like. I know what the presence of something genuinely dangerous feels like. I'd always understood, intellectually, why humans had become what they'd become in the galaxy's power structures. On Cathara Station, watching Calloway walk through a corridor with a drink in his hand and a tired expression, and that quality in him, that thing that the Granthari felt and couldn't name and chose not to test, I understood it differently. Not intellectually, directly, the way you understand weather when you're standing in it. Before I left, I found him one more time, Departure Lounge, Sector 4. He was sitting against a wall with his pack between his feet, reading something on a small device. He looked up when I approached. "Delegate Torian," he said. "I wanted to say goodbye," I said. He nodded, put the device away. "Where do you go from here?" I asked. Something moved briefly in his face, not quite a smile. "Where they send me," he said. "And when they send you somewhere difficult." He looked at me for a moment. "Same thing I always do," he said. "Show up, pay attention, try not to leave anything undone that should be done." I thought about that. It seemed, on one level, like a very simple answer. Like something anyone might say about any job. On another level, from what I'd seen of Ren Calloway and of humans in general, it was something else. A philosophy, an orientation, a relationship with the world that had been built out of 300,000 years of being prey and several thousand years of figuring out that the thing that kept you alive was not the absence of fear but the presence of will. "Safe travels," I said. "You too," he said, and then after a pause, "You're good at your job, I noticed." I didn't know quite what to say to that, so I just nodded. He picked up his device again. I walked away through the departure lounge of Cathara Station, past beings from 14 species all moving toward their separate destinations, and I thought about what Merva Soth had said. Beautiful or terrifying? Probably both. The lights of the station arced overhead, that engineered amber that was supposed to soothe everyone and satisfied no one completely. And through the nearest viewport, the stars were doing what stars do, just being there, indifferent and constant and vast. And somewhere in the Terran Compact's operational networks, a record of what had happened in Corridor 9 was being processed and filed and used as evidence. Because one human had paid attention and positioned himself correctly, and done what needed to be done without fanfare, and without asking permission, and without any apparent interest in recognition. That was the thing, I realized, that I couldn't quite categorize. Not the capability, not the training, not even the neurochemistry and the evolved predator awareness that manifested as something other species perceived as apex threat. It was that humans seemed genuinely uninterested in being feared. They wanted to be effective. They wanted to get the job done. The fear their presence generated in others was, for them, a byproduct, a tool maybe, but not the goal. The goal was always something else. Smaller and more specific and harder to quantify. The person in the corridor who needed someone to walk between them and the thing coming toward them. The communication relay that needed to stay uncompromised. The summit that needed to conclude with something better than war. The species that needed someone to show up and pay attention and try not to leave anything undone. Humanity had arrived in the galaxy terrifying and confusing and deeply, structurally strange, and they'd built their reputation not on conquest, though they were very capable of it, but on the grinding, unglamorous practice of showing up to difficult situations and doing the necessary thing. No species wanted them as enemies. I think the more important truth, though the one that gets lost in the accounts of combat records and win ratios and the specific terror of encountering a human unit that has decided to hold a position, the more important truth is this. Everyone eventually wanted them on their side. Not because of what they could destroy, because of what they would protect. I wrote this account for the Velhari Diplomatic Archive 4 years after the Cathara Summit. Specialist Ren Calloway was awarded the Meridian Compact's Cross of Service at some point after this, for something classified that I was told about informally and will not include in an archived report. He is, to the best of my knowledge, still in the field, still doing what they send him to do. Still showing up. Pay attention when a human tells you a thing is important to them. Because from everything I've observed in 26 years of interspecies work, nothing in the galaxy is quite as immovable as a human who has decided that something matters. Nothing,